Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Joining me is Senior Managing Editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com, where you can access all the Tribune's faith coverage, ad-free podcast episodes, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/MormonLand. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. There was a time in the 1960s when Cleon Skousen, who died in 2006 at 92, was a widely known and controversial conservative figure in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was a popular speaker, teacher, and writer whose books about scriptures reflected a literal, non-modernist approach to the Bible. He was a zealous anti-communist who freely mixed his Mormonism with his political views. He worked for a time as a special agent for the FBI and later as Salt Lake City's police chief. His books, including The First 2,000 Years, became ubiquitous in Latter-day Saint homes as members grappled with the Cold War and predictions of an imminent apocalypse. Latter-day Saint historian Benjamin Park is working on a biography of Skousen and is here to discuss the man's early beginnings and why his works are finding an unexpected audience among President Trump's supporters today. Welcome, Ben.
Always a privilege to be here.
Always, you pick the most interesting topics, Ben.
I don't know if I'm trying to punish myself for sins performed in a past life, but I always like to choose topics that at least expand my horizons. We'll say that.
All right. So, can we ask you to briefly summarize Cleon Skousen's career arc and how he came to be so influential?
Yeah, Cleon Skousen and his family often joke that he had 7 different careers, and that really captures his eclectic trajectory. He was raised in different Mormon communities in Canada and California and even Mexico, graduated from a junior college in Southern California, went to get his law degree from George Washington, was hired by the FBI, spent a decade and a half as a special agent in the communications. Then he was hired at BYU to run their fundraising initiative among alumni. He became a celebrity anti-communist, speaking to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people a year, delivering hundreds of addresses. I don't think he ever entered a room that he didn't lecture in. And then he came back to BYU, became a professor of religion, where he taught an entire generation of young Latter-day Saints how to read the Book of Mormon, before then founding a anti-communist American founding-centered institute, originally called the Freeman Institute, later changed to the National Center for Constitutional Studies, that really was the historical arm of the Religious Right Coalition. And throughout all of this, he produced reams and reams of papers and many books that shaped not just the LDS community, but the broader American society writ large, and how they viewed threats like communism as well as sacralized the founding fathers.
So let me fast forward really fast now to today. Are there modern politicians that have embraced Skousen's views, and why have they?
A lot more than you might think. One of my favorite anecdotes is at Charlie Kirk's funeral last September. Ben Carson, who was a GOP presidential nominee candidate in 2016, said that there was a man before Charlie Kirk who made many of the same arguments as Charlie Kirk, a man named Cleon Skousen, whose book, The Naked Communist, exposed the Marxist ideas infiltrating our public sphere. That weekend, by the way, Skousen's Naked Communist, initially published in 1958, became a bestseller on Amazon. Which is just remarkable. I wish I could have a book that becomes a bestseller 70 years after its publication. But that's far from an exception, because his book, 5,000 Year Leap, became a New York Times bestseller in 2009, 40 years or 30 years after that one was published, because it became a primary textbook for the Tea Party movement. And there's plenty of other figures like Rick Scott, the former Texas governor, who have explicitly cited Skousen as some of their key influences. So it's remarkable that even if his name isn't as well known as it used to, and may be seen as an oddity to many mainstream circles, it still, Skousen's work and ideas remain deeply influential in certain segments of America.
Also, why did Ben Carson compare Skousen to Charlie Kirk? Whoa, like what?
So there's a direct influence, and then there's a broader idea that I think they both represent in Carson's mind. The direct influences to Ben Carson, one of the great things that Charlie Kirk did in his mind was expose the Marxism that's at the root of our public education, of our government, that these ideas of socialism have infiltrated and corrupted all the institutions that are crucial to American society. We need to root it out. And according to Carson, it was Cleon Skousen who first identified all these problems back in the 50s. But I think there's also a larger trajectory that Skousen represents, and that people like Charlie Kirk fulfill, this idea of a conspiratorial notion that there are these mischievous, devious, evil powers in the earth trying to undermine freedom. And what Skousen did is he offered a compelling theological, sociological framework through which to understand how the world operates and how to oppose all these dangers and threats. So in many ways, the same talking points that dominate much of this anti-Marxist, what we would now call anti-woke culture, really had its first expressions, or its popularizing expressions, through Cleon Skousen in the 50s and 60s, before he then merged into other topics.
So I'm going to go to one of his, I guess, more religious books. But there was a time, it seems, that every Latter-day Saint home had a copy of Skousen's First 2,000 Years, often right alongside Bruce R. McConkie's Mormon Doctrine. What was that book about? Did it reflect any modern politics at the time?
So it reflected a lot of modern politics, not a lot of modern scholarship. So I vividly remember visiting my grandparents' ward in rural Idaho and looking up to the podium to the teacher. And the two books she carried that day while she was teaching on the Old Testament was the Bible and the First 2,000 Years. Not even the manual was necessary in this class. Those are the core texts. And I think that signified how compelling that book is. So Skousen taught gospel doctrine, or what we now call gospel doctrine, Sunday school for adult classes for several decades. And he wanted to make the scriptures come alive to its readers. But more so, he wanted modern readers to know that all the problems we're facing today had already been identified and solved by these past patriarchs. And so he offers this very compelling narrative that makes these old prophets in the Old Testament, all the way up to Abraham, very much like us. He digs into their psyche. He talks about how they are encountering the same types of dynamics that we do. He closes the first 2,000 years by saying that those prophets back then operate just like prophets today, and our problems are cyclical. And so if we want to solve today's modern issues, we need to turn to the past. And so as a result of that hermeneutic, that means so much of politics and the contemporary concerns are found in his readings of these ancient patriarchs. Cain was the first socialist because he slew his brother Abel due to his lusting after his land. Moses was the first capitalist because he's introducing a free market system for people who had been oppressed under Ramses. He denounces those who try to find a connection between the law of consecration and communitarian teachings in the scriptures and socialism today, saying that no, it's all based on fundamentally different principles. You can even read through in each of the chapters of his First 2,000 Years, where he has these study questions of these are the questions you should have in mind as you read this book of scripture. And when he gets to like the secret society, he says like, What secret societies do you think are in operation today? How are they undermining freedom? And how can we learn from the prophets of the past to combat them? And so Skousen taught generations of Latter-day Saints how to read the scriptures in a way that reaffirm particular political principles, because he saw his political and religious visions fused in a world where the answers to all those problems are the same.
So under Cleon Skousen, for instance, you could look to Moses or Abraham or Jacob to find answers to the immigration question or whatever, right?
He argues that Moses foresaw the type of immigration policies that hardliners create today, that there are no new problems under the sun. It's all been things that God has already spoken of. So we're not progressing to some point in the future where we're going to finally, establish God's order. We need to restore to God's order. We need to return to those glory days of the past, which is why scripture reading is such a potent political tool in combating modern evils.
You mentioned that another one of his books has become a bestseller again. What was the 5,000-year leap? What's that about?
So if Skousen was dedicated to denouncing and identifying socialism's corrosions in modern society in the 1950s and 1960s, by the 1970s, he believes that the true saving point for the modern United States is to return back to what he called the formula of the founders, the ideas of the founding fathers that really set in motion the modern society. So he writes, when he creates this new institute, first called the Freeman Institute, he writes a textbook and he titles it The 5,000-Year Leap, because he says what we are unlocking here is when the Europeans first arrive and colonize the New World, they are still a very backward people. And then it takes nearly 2 centuries for them to get to a point to where they introduce the principles of freedom in the form of the American Revolution and the creation of the United States. And then since that point, in just the 200 years past that point, the humanity takes a 5,000-year leap, making more progress and more development during those 2 centuries than they had in the 5,000 years before that. And he says how they did that was establishing these principles of liberty that are so crucial to human thriving, that, he argued, were now under threat, and that the 20th century was a story of apostasy from those founding principles. And the only way to solve that is to return to what he identifies as these 28 principles of the founding fathers. And so that was the key argument of the 5,000-year leap, this Christian libertarian idea of America being founded as a Christian nation on free market principles that all the founding fathers had agreed on and are the solution to modern America.
So, and you've talked a little bit about this already, Ben, but how did Skousen's religious literalism reflect his political ideology?
Yeah, if Skousen hated something as much as socialism, it was modern biblical scholarship. What he calls this mysticism and this supernaturalism of trying to twist the words of the Bible to meet modern sensibilities. All of this modernist scholarship, he argued, is a distraction of God's glory. That when God penned the Bible in the form of the prophets, he was telling literal truth. There was a global flood. Adam lived until about 1,000 years old. There were literal curses placed on people, and that showed God's power. It was an idea of modern scholarship is taking us away from these fundamental truths. So again, this declension narrative of losing our truths and being corrupted by modern scholarship. And so when he wrote his first book in 1938, titled Prophecy in Modern Times, he directly denounces this modern scholarship that tries to soften what he called the sophistry of these academics. And instead, we need to focus on the beauties and the simplicity of God's narrative, because that's going to be the sign of who God's chosen interpreters are, based on how they interpret these things. And as a result, many Latter-day Saints learned to read the Bible and the Book of Mormon literally. that those are things that literally happened. An explicit rejection of modern academic scholarship that he argues undercuts the significance of those truths. And for many, I think that's why the first 2,000 years was so compelling, because in many Latter-day Saints' minds, it cuts through the morass of all these disputed passages and academic meanings to a simple telling of God's truth that matches the Bible stories of their childhood.
But doesn't, like the LDS Church and BYU, its premier institution, spend a lot of time on modern scholarship of Scripture, right?
Yeah, I think one of the anxieties that drove Skousen to make this argument was that he believed that there were many LDS leaders who were forfeiting it. That there were leaders that in the 1930s, when he's a student, there's James Talmage and John Widsoe, who are offering more scientifically inclined ideas of interpretation that allow things like evolution. And there are plenty of LDS educators and academics who are doing similarly. The 1930s, when Skousen writes his first text, that's the same decade that you have a number of LDS educators participating in what we call the Chicago experiment, where the church sends them to the University of Chicago's Divinity School to learn this modernist scholarship that then gets rejected explicitly by J. Reuben Clark, who in his charted course address in 1938 at Aspen Grove to LDS educators said that we are not to listen to these modernist scholarships. We are to focus on the fundamentals. And Cleon Skousen could not agree any more with that. He believes that giving in to those scientific academic learnings means giving up fundamental truths. And so that is held in, in tension. When he's at BYU in the 1950s, working in the alumni office, but also lecturing, and he publishes his first 2,000 years book, he's told that a lot of the BYU religion professors don't like it. And so he's like, you know what? Maybe I should listen to their criticisms. And he signs up for a Hebrew class, and he only lasts a couple of weeks. And then he realized, no, I'm more interested in interpreting this on my own. And so this is a very divergent interpretive tradition that I think is actually dying out in the LDS tradition, though there are still some who hold on to these literalist reading of the Bible, and those people will typically cite Cleon Skousen as their authority.
Would Joseph Fielding Smith been seen as an ally of Cleon Skousen?
Yes, he definitely would. Joseph Fielding Smith actually helped make Skousen's privately published book, Prophecy in Modern Times, a Deseret book publication a decade later, and they often cited each other. Now, they had a bit of a theological falling out later years on over these types of literalistic readings, specifically on their theologies of the atonement. So much so that Joseph Fielding Smith would often write dismissively of Skousen's, but that was often an internal literalist disagreement rather than an overall hermeneutic divergence in how they view the scriptures.
Mormonland will be right back. So some of his writings were in the 60s, as we said, and there was the big Cold War was a big thing. What was the role of end time prophecies in his politics?
Oh, so much. That was the focus of that first book, Prophecy in Modern Times, that he says that God has laid out these signs of the times, these endless wars that are going to consume the world until God's second coming appears. And when he taught this in his Sunday school in Washington, D.C., there are some of these learned elites that he often saw as his foes saying that, oh, prophecy is just educated guessing or lucky guessing, that we actually need to turn to these more progressive ideas of how the world unfolds. And Skousen takes that personally. He says that no, God was clear in the scriptures about what the end times look like. And those end times look a lot like what we are living through right now. And we can expect these global convulsions to enrapture the world and bring about the second coming. And that's something that we should acknowledge. And while not embrace the grisly details, recognize that that's a sign of the times. And so this apocalypticism, this millenarianism, infused his writings, and it also gave him a sense of anxiety. It is time to warn the world that the earth is coming to an end and that we need to repent and embrace Christ's salvific mission. Otherwise, we are going to be cast in along with the Gentiles who are consumed by fire rather than gathering with God's chosen at the New Zion in Independence, Missouri.
Ben, could you talk about how he was able to address other religious leaders of other Christian denominations, even though they wouldn't have considered him necessarily a Christian or necessarily respect his Mormonism?
Yeah, this was one of the most fascinating things to me as I started digging into Skousen's papers. Was I knew that he was very successful at courting evangelicals and supporting his mission, who otherwise would find his theology as heresy. So, for instance, we started this discussion with at the Charlie Kirk funeral, where he is cited as the Charlie Kirk before Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk's first radio show after his death was hosted by Mark Driscoll, an evangelical pastor, who has also frequently cited Cleon Skousen as an important political writer, who says that the man who killed Charlie Kirk was deluded by the demonic spirit of Mormonism. And so how do we reconcile that? That the same people who believe that Mormonism is demonic will also embrace Cleon Skousen's writing. And I think that's because Skousen was very smart in how he packaged his ideas that were intimately and inextricably tethered to his Mormon belief in a way that could be consumed by people who believe that Mormonism is a cult. So, for instance, his first national bestseller book, The Naked Communist, published in 1958, when I read through that book last year, I was amazed at how full of Mormonism it was, without acknowledging it, right? His definition of liberty, his narrative of human events, his framing of Moses, his explanation of these secret combinations, all of those come as a result or are tied to Book of Mormon scriptures or Doctrine and Covenants prophecies without citing them. And he learned this from an early age when he was a Sunday school teacher in Washington, D.C., and his stake president was Ezra Taft Benson. Before Benson was an apostle. Benson tells him, look, I want to do some interdenominational outreach. I want you to go to some of the other churches in DC and just say you have an Easter message to share. And if they ask you, what church do you come from? Just say, oh, I'm from the church on 16th Street, which anyone who is familiar with DC geography know that the 16th Street has a church on every chapel. So it's very much a dodging. Or if he cites the Book of Mormon and they ask what scripture was that, he said, oh, it comes from a revelation of Jesus Christ. And that really frames so much of what he does. So in 1966, David O. McKay, who was the prophet at the time, calls Skousen in and says, look, I want you to come back to BYU. I want you to teach the youth how to read the Book of Mormon, because McKay also reads this anti-communist framework into LDS doctrine. And he says, I also want you to start an institute to teach the importance of American capitalism and freedom to oppose these socialist inroads, and create an institute not affiliated with BYU and not even affiliated with the church, but you're going to save the Constitution with all different faiths. And that's the origin of the Freeman. And I love the title the Freeman, which he first names the Institute, because it's this perfect code switching. Freeman, of course, we know is a term from the Book of Mormon that identifies these people fighting for freedom. It's also a term that the founding fathers used. And so depending on what audience he's speaking to, he can play up or down these various terminologies. And as a result, he is fully embraced by many of these evangelical speakers, including Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, Tim LaHaye. They all invite him in, support his work, encourage people to participate in his constitutional history seminars, so much so that he really becomes the historical wing of the religious right movement. Just like how he taught Mormons how to read the scriptures in an anti-communist way, now he teaches the American nation how to read American history in his uniquely Mormon way without identifying it as Mormon.
Okay, so how did Skousen's writing influence or parallel those of Ezra Taft Benson and the connection to the John Birch Society? You've talked about the Freeman Institute, but Benson, I've forgotten he was his stake president, I guess, right?
Yeah, their histories were intertangled very early on. As I mentioned before, Benson was a stake president, and then when he's called as an apostle, Skousen is rising the ranks in popularity, and they often cite each other. They work with each other closely. Benson praises Skousen's work in public setting, which gives him a degree of credibility among Latter-day Saints. Benson helps get his work published by the church press. And then Skousen, in turn, often uses Benson as evidence of this prophetic call for anti-communism, usually citing him as this is a prophetic voice we need to hear the most. And that continues throughout Benson's life. When Skousen creates the Freeman Institute and they move into this grand new building in Salt Lake City, Benson is the featured speaker. Benson is the one who is encouraging local Latter-day Saint communities to host these Freeman Institute events. Also, the Birch Society has an interesting relationship. Just like with Benson, Skousen is never an official member of the Birch Society, which he would often say, but he often defended the Birch Society in print and in public because he believed that they were working in parallel ways. He recognized that the Birch Society had a bit of a reputation, so it would tarnish his standing to be more ecumenical if he worked with the Birchers, but he did publish these works saying that what the Birches are doing are important. In fact, there was one moment when the Birchers have this big public controversy in the nation and a lot of conservatives have to denounce them. Skousen publishes a pamphlet on the attack on the John Birch Society saying, "I find it interesting that the same month that the Communist Party in Russia identified the Birch Society as their biggest enemies, that now all the American media and politicians are taking up those talking points." So to Skousen, it was evidence of this socialist inroads that people were opposing the Birch Society. Now, they eventually diverge ways in the 1980s. Skousen gets in trouble for a book he writes titled The Making of America, which had some very controversial, we'll call them, passages about slavery and history that become have such a firestorm that the Birch Society has to publicly break with him. And then Skousen has to put out his own statement saying, "No, you can't break up with me. I'm breaking up with you." And so, but that was really internal debates. I think all three of these bodies, Skousen, Benson, and Birch, are all working in these same anti-communist fronts, sometimes encroaching on one another's territory, but more often working in tandem to oppose communism's inroads.
Speaking of that, what is the premise of The Naked Communist? What's the premise of that book?
So the title of The Naked Communist was actually offered to Skousen by Cecil B. DeMille, the famous director of the Ten Commandments movie, who said that you really strip down communism to where it's bearing all and there's nothing actually hiding its corruption. So the book was actually originated as a prophetic assignment. David O. McKay told the BYU president, Ernest Wilkinson, that America is sleeping on the dangers of communism. I want you to create a committee of BYU faculty to write a textbook to expose how dangerous communism is and why we need to confront this threat. That committee does not work that well. Skousen had different views than the fellow professors. And so Skousen eventually publishes his own book, The Naked Communist, trying to show that these are the evils of communism that have been around ever since the founding. The evils of communism preceded Marx and Engels. They're found in these early secret combinations. This is where the Mormonism comes through, that now takes on its latest iteration in the Communist Front and the Socialist Party that is making inroads in the United States, in our public education, in our government officials, in all these institutions, in our media. And it is my job to expose it. That's what The Naked Communist does. And it ends up it goes on to sell nearly 2 million copies in its first 3 years.
Is that the book that David O. McKay held up at conference, conference?
There's actually a fascinating story behind that, because when Skousen writes this full manuscript, he couldn't find anyone that wanted to publish it. All the big Eastern presses shied away from it because this is in the wake of the Joseph McCarthy hearings, where the anti-communist crusade, the Red Scare, seemed to dwindle and they deemed it too controversial. BYU wouldn't publish it because the faculty didn't think it was up to their qualities. And the church wouldn't publish it because they feared it would look like them jumping into the political sphere. So Skousen thought that, well, I guess I wrote this for no one to read. And then David O. McKay tells him, well, if you go out and publish it on your own and take the financial risk, I will make sure you make your money back. So Skousen takes out a mortgage on his home, publishes a book with creates his own imprint, Ensign Press. Thomas S. Monson, then a printer, he's not an apostle yet, lets him print it on his press. And then a year later, David O. McKay goes up and holds up the book in General Conference and says Latter-day Saints should purchase a copy. And from that point on, Skousen couldn't keep up with all the demand. And once it remained in print and became popular, then the John Birch Society and these circles outside of Mormonism pick it up. And that's what ends up vaulting Skousen to a national celebrity, typically giving around 300 lectures a year over the next few years.
So when I hear communism, it just reeks of yesterday's news. Do you know what I mean? What place would Skousen find today if he were alive to comment on today's political climate if it wasn't communism?
I think there'd be quite a bit that Skousen would have to say about the current political climate, and not all of it would fit our contemporary political divide. I think he would argue, because he saw communism as just the latest iteration of this broader anti-liberty threat that dates back to Cain when he slew Abel, that he would say that impulse to take one another's gain and to have ill-gotten wealth and to socialize America, he would still say that that's a threat. He would probably be echoing a lot of this anti-woke culture. He would be denouncing Marxism's intervention in schools and in scholarship. Yet, I don't think he would be, at least a lot of his ideas don't fully mesh with today's MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement. Because as much as he hated socialism, he also hated populism. He wanted a kind of hierarchical control. He always emphasized this is a republic, not a democracy. And so I think the populism of today's MAGA right would also startle him. I think he would see the insurrection on the Capitol in 2021, for instance, as a threat, because that would show the mob rule taking over. He always argued that on the one hand, we have communism and socialism and state control, and on the other hand, we have anarchy or people's rule. And what we need is something in the middle. And that's why he always rejected the idea of being an extreme right or a conservative. He says, I'm offering the middle road here. Now that categorization does not match how we typically define politics, but it does tell us a lot about how he viewed himself. So I think he would echo a lot of the arguments we see in today's conservative movement, but at least how he presented his ideas decades ago, there would also be quite a bit of dissonance.
So he wouldn't, in your view, he wouldn't necessarily be a MAGA or even a Trump supporter.
I mean, it's hard to say because,
of course,
figures change, right? A lot of people who support Trump today literally opposed Trump in 2016, right? So maybe he would evolve, or maybe he would change or revise his ideas, or maybe he would just live in, contradictions like many of us do. But I do think that we can trace an evolution in the American right from the type of ideas that Skousen was trumpeting decades ago to the type of ideas that are at the heart of the American conservative movement today.
But he would be very at home in conspiracy theories that go around all the time, right? That sort of seems to be the breeding ground for these things.
Yeah, what we would denounce as conspiracy theories, he would say as evidence of this global cabal that has been with us always, trying to undercut our freedoms. And so going through his papers, he has, it is folders and folders of these printouts of newspaper clippings that seem to have evidence of all these, conspiracies that he believed proved his theories at work. You just think of the gif from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia with the guy on the shoestrings on the wall and waving his arms around. I think that he added some credibility to that type of idea.
It's interesting to me that MAGA, but also Cleon Skousen, the really big bad communist was Russia.
Yeah.
And now it's like Donald Trump pro-Russia.
Yep, I think that's one of the best examples of how much the right has changed. I have a hard time thinking that Skousen would have been on board with this shift in the right. Maybe he would. We all change. We all live in inconsistencies.
Yeah.
As Ralph Waldo Emerson quipped, foolish consistency is a hobgoblin of little minds. So maybe he would have changed that. But I do think that charting these influential historical characters is a great way to trace how so much of our political discourse that we take for granted today is historically constructed. And we only see that when we can compare it to the evolutions of the past.
So again, there's Russia. In some ways, by not making about all, thousands of years of history conflict, that's how you kind of get out of, well, Russia was it for a while. Maybe now it isn't. I don't know.
Right.
So what do you see as Cleon Skousen's lasting legacy on the church and then on society?
I think there are at least two lasting legacies that we can point out to Skousen. One is his scriptural hermeneutics, or how we interpret scriptures. He taught literally generations of Latter-day Saints on what questions to ask of the scriptures, how to move verse by verse. He was training thousands of students every year at BYU. Whenever I post about Skousen on my different social platforms, inevitably I get comments from people saying, I took Skousen while I was at BYU, or my parents read Skousen, or Skousen books were on our shelves. So I think he left an indelible impact on LDS scriptural interpretation. And I think socially, he was one of, though not the only, crucial voices that helped move American society toward the right in American politics. To where in the mid-20th century, Mormons were much more diverse in their politics. Utah was a swing state. Mormonism was not synonymous with a particular political vision. And Skousen's work was so successful, his ideas were so beloved by so many Latter-day Saints, that he and Benson and others helped change that, creating these alliances, these political alliances that are still very much in place today.
Well, Benjamin Park, this has been terrifically interesting. Thanks for joining us.
It's always an honor.
And thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up. We'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.